Same old man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for October 2nd, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this week, everybody, for this conversation. Brendan, how do you feel about your creator overlords?
If you're talking about you, then I feel great. I'm gonna start calling you Nirmata.
Yeah, maybe you should. I am the creator, at least of In Session Film.
You are the creator. You are of In Session Film for sure. That is absolutely a fact. Like I said, I'm gonna start calling you Nirmata as it's referenced here in the movie.
Yes. I can at least, claim In Session Film in 2 children. That's all that I have.
I mean, that's not nothing.
It's not nothing.
You've patented a few things if you want to use that term for it.
Sure, absolutely. I can make claim to those 3 children. This one being the oldest of the 3.
Yeah, they all have your DNA in some way, shape, or form.
They do? Absolutely. So
blood, sweat, and tears all poured into them.
Exactly. 100%. So, we're here to talk about Gareth Edwards' new film, The Creator, starring John David Washington, an actor that I will always cherish and adore because it is not the only actor that I'm aware of anyway. He might be the only person on the planet that shares the same first name as me. And I will never let that go.
John David, man.
So him and I, we're like this. We're close.
You're brothers.
I will never say a bad thing about the man.
No, you're brothers, right?
Exactly. So Gareth Edwards, before we get into the review, and I don't want to get too far into this, because I'm sure we'll have many thoughts.
It'll feed into our feelings on the creator, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So a general consensus, Brennan, synopsis, if you will. How would you sum up in a sentence, maybe 2, your feelings on one Gareth Edwards coming into the creator? Maybe not coming out, but going in.
Empty beauty.
That's way less than 2 sentences. That's just 2 words.
Trying to challenge myself. Only because I feel like he needs less words in his movies sometimes. So I thought I'd give myself less words in describing his movies. But okay, if I'm going to do 2 sentences or something brief in that kind of context, more than just 2 words, his movies are visually dazzling. I remember very little about them as time goes on. That's really the basis of it. I feel like he usually misses the mark on character and story and theme. And we'll talk about this when we get to the creator as well. But even looking at his 4 feature films, I thought to myself, how would I rank these movies? I don't know that I can. I don't think I can.
I think that's very fair. I will simply say for now that I very much do agree with all of those sentiments, short or elongated. The other thing that came to mind for me as well is that while I do agree with you in terms of storytelling and characters, there is something about going back and revisiting his films in hindsight that I admittedly have come to appreciate a little bit more. I think on a first go, I'm so caught up in how disappointed I am by the lack of storytelling and emotional nuance in his films that sometimes I probably overlook the craft and how much fun there can be in his films if you simply go in looking for that exclusively and nothing else.
Yeah.
And I think that has been my experience with at least Godzilla and Rogue One. I've gone back and rewatched both of those movies since they've come out, since we've reviewed them here on the show, and I feel like I have enjoyed them more on a rewatch.
Okay.
But that's within the context of accepting them for what they are. Not because they're better in hindsight, but it just comes with a level of acceptance.
Well, and that's something we will talk about is Gareth Edwards' ability to simply craft a set piece, a look, an aesthetic, regardless of who he's working with as a cinematographer. And the creator, which we'll talk about, has 2 credited cinematographers. And his movies just look a certain way that blockbusters don't, which is why we have to at least acknowledge how well made that they are, especially in the landscape of blockbuster filmmaking nowadays. So like if I sound a little cynical with regard to his movies, it's because I want them to be so much better. I really do. And I think I would love it if he just one day made a silent movie. If he just like strip back storytelling and made a silent movie, I actually would love to see that. I feel like that would really go well with him because he's actually really good at visual storytelling. It's actual storytelling that I usually have an issue with.
For sure. And we'll get into that with the creator. So let's jump right in. As we noted, it is directed by Gareth Edwards. He also co-wrote the screenplay here with Chris Weitz. It stars the aforementioned John David Washington, as well as Gemma Chan, Ken Watanabe, Allison Janney, and I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce her name. I probably should have looked this up beforehand. Madeline Yuna Voiles. I'm probably butchering that, so forgive me. We'll certainly talk about her as well. If you're not familiar with the creator, against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The backdrop of a war between humans and robots with artificial intelligence, a former soldier finds the secret weapon, a robot in the form of a young child. Okay.
Can't help but laugh at the Vietnam War jab you threw out there. Not even really a jab. It's all over this movie.
It's all look, we'll get into it.
We will. And I do want to throw out, we were supposed to be joined by our good friend Win Lee on this review, and he has a great thread on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it now, sort of talking about the representation of the Vietnamese and that culture as it's represented in this film. We'll probably allude to what he spoke to in his...
Brennan is very much jumping the gun here.
Well, at least you mentioned Vietnam. I feel like it's at least pertinent to throw out something there. We want our listeners to know that it's not our... it's not our analysis there. Win Lee had a really great interpretation there as far as what it's representing. We wanted to give credit where credit is due.
Absolutely. And we'll certainly get into that as we talk about those elements of the film. And as Brendan noted, sadly, he could not be here. We did try to get him on for this conversation. All right. With that said, let's jump right into it. Brendan, what did you think about the creator?
It's a Gareth Edwards film, so it's the same thing once again for me. It really is. And this is the one I want to like the most out of all of his movies, though. And primarily it's because, I mean, we'll talk about this. It is an original story. And for those watching us on YouTube, I'm using quotes around original story here. And that's simply because it's not based on an existing medium. Although it might as well be, just given how many parallels are here with other sci-fi movies. And I kind of wonder about that. I was randomly watching a video on YouTube. I think it was from Chris Stuckman, who mentioned that, or at least he theorized that the reason why this film pulls from so many other existing sci-fi films is because of the difficulty in getting original content made nowadays. Is that the best way to sell it is to prove how it's like something else that was already successful. And maybe that's the case. I honestly don't know, but the fact of the matter is there are many times while watching The Creator where I was so distracted by the blatant copy and pasting happening from The Terminator, from Akira, from what else? AI is in here a little bit as far as the childlike component. Blade Runner, there's even a mention in the beginning, more human than human, which is ripped directly from Blade Runner. And that can be distracting at times for sure, but that really isn't my biggest problem. It's once again the Gareth Edwards syndrome, if I want to call it that, where I I find myself so immersed in what is happening visually and aesthetically, but I just find the film so emotionally despondent. And that would be fine if that's what it's going for, if it's really trying to put those things secondary. But I think the creator is the film that Gareth Edwards is trying to prove that he does have an emotional gravitas, and I just don't think he gets there. And maybe it is the the trite narrative here. Maybe it is that redundancy that it is so similar to other sci-fi films, but I don't think it has any real value. And that's unfortunate given the timing of this movie. The fact that we are coming off the heels of AI being such a talking point in the film world, right?
Yeah.
With regard to SAD
Absolutely.
and the VGA, and like all of those things happening. And I do want to talk a little bit more about the film's depiction of AI, which is provocative in an accidental way, I guess. I'll at least leave it at that. I don't think that's necessarily a credit to the film, but I will say there's at least some things I want to talk about with the film's representation of AI. But I just don't think the film really has the weight that it is going for, despite the literal physical weight that is represented on screen, which is dazzling. So if anything, I will say, as much as I am mixed on the film overall, I do want people to see it because I want to see films like this succeed that aren't based on some IP, literally speaking. The film is recorded at an $80 million budget, I think, which is pretty extensive to see a movie like this with that kind of budget. So I want it to succeed in those regards, even if I don't necessarily think it's that great of a film.
Yeah, and I think it has a long way to go if it is going to succeed. I believe its opening weekend was somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million.
Something like that.
Something to that effect. So a long way to go, but who knows? Maybe it'll have an Elemental type run. We shall see.
Yeah.
I am also very mixed on this film, and the best way for me to articulate without being redundant, especially for longtime listeners who have heard us talk about Godzilla back in 2014 or Rogue One when that came out. Brendan, we are in the middle of college football season.
Oh, yeah, we are.
So I'm going to pull from college football. I think a lot of our listeners watch football in one way or another.
Yeah.
So I'm going to the world of college football as an analogy here, because Gareth Edwards reminds me of one of those schools that can score at will. The offense is a train that no one can stop, but they play no defense. So they're like USC.
God, that'd be so funny if he graduated from USC.
I don't know. When they're on offense, you can't look away. Yeah. It's electrifying to watch. But on defense, it's an utter disaster. That's Gareth Edwards. The man has an astounding offensive coordinator, a.k.a. his cinematographer. His movies are gorgeous to look at. And if we're going to continue the football analogy even further, the offensive assistant coaches, a.k.a. the set designer, the composer, the sound design team, they're all really great too. Edwards' films are incredibly immersive from a visual and aesthetic and world-building perspective. There's a rigorous intensity to them. They're explosive and diverting. However, his defensive coordinator, a.k.a. his writers, oh boy, they leave a lot to be desired. The play calling is conventional, it's messy, it's uneven, and the overall scheme is too impulsive and facile. The editing isn't very good either, and as a result, the storytelling is disjointed and the characters are hollow. He's in need of a new defensive coordinator in a big way, and not just because there's a muddled nature to his films, but they're so incredibly immersive that if the story and characters had more heft to them, he truly could be one of the best modern blockbuster filmmakers working today.
I agree.
And that's my issue with all of his films, as you noted, Brendan. Monster, Godzilla, Rogue One, and now The Creator. They're all engrossing experiences in terms of world building, lore, and visuals. But equally, I have a hard time engaging with his characters and emotional nuance. And sadly, The Creator falls exactly within the formula with Edwards in every regard.
Which is interesting because he hasn't written all of his films, and all of his major films have, for the most part, different screenwriters, right?
Yeah.
And yet they all weirdly feel like they were written by the same person. So so it almost makes me think, while your defensive allegory is accurate, is it actually more of a direction problem at times in the way that he chooses to visualize and interpret the script, whether he wrote the script or not?
It has his thumbprint on all of them. So regardless of the defensive scheme, if you will, he, as the head coach, is taking that scheme and implementing it within his vision, within his style.
Yeah.
And whether that's fair or not to the actual screenplay, whatever is there on the page, we may not ever really know. But it is interesting whether it's him calling those defensive plays, if you will, if it's him writing the script or bringing in someone else. You're right that there is a weird redundancy to all of them. Even if the details are different from the film, they all have a similar thing, the similar backbone to all of them.
A similar thing. It's just about as detailed as most of his movies are.
I was trying to figure out a different way to say it's the same thing all over again.
Well, hey, you joked about this offline when you and I were texting each other about this. At least he's consistent, right?
He's consistent.
but that's, exactly. That's something we like to see out of filmmakers, regardless if we like their material or not, is that there is a connectivity between all of his films. You can tell all four of his major films, from Monsters all the way through to The Creator, they feel like they were of the same mind. They all like they have a similar mood, a similar tone, a similar vibe. The way that he, even though he's working with different cinematographers as well, it's the way he has an eye for sense of scale.
It's incredible.
Whether you look at Rogue One, especially the way he visualizes the Death Star or the AT-ATs or AT-ATs, whatever you want to call them. He does it at like a human level, as if you are looking up at them. And there's like the way the camera moves to gradually reveal that hugeness.
Yeah, it's engrossing. It's so good.
He did the same thing with Godzilla, and he does the same thing here with The Creator, that giant spaceship that is overlooking everything, called Nomad.
You mean the Death Star?
The Death Star, yeah. Okay, like the functionality of it is so redundant.
It's the same thing, really.
He visualizes it so well. Like the way he, I mean, even the world building of the cities around New Asia feel very ripped from Blade Runner as well. So,
I mean, you really are right in all of that. The sense of scale here is mesmerizing. That despite how we feel about the characters and the storytelling, we're so immersed into this world that by the time we're halfway through the film, and especially at the end, the moment we start to see those lasers hit the ground, there's this palpable tension. It's almost visceral. And that is a huge credit to him as a storyteller. And that's why I just find his film so frustrating, because if the story was there, if the characters were fleshed out and realized, imagine how much we would be salivating for the next Gareth Edwards movie.
That's why I was so hoping for this one. I was so optimistic about The Creator, really hoping for something great. And I thought it could have been there, primarily because it has a really good cast, and I love John David Washington. I actually think he's pretty good here. I think if anything fails him, it is the writing. I think that in some of those early scenes, especially some of those weird Nolan-esque flashback scenes that he has with Gemma Chan, I think there is a tender quality to them, but it's interrupted by a lot of exposition. And there's a lot of constant telling. And something I said earlier in my opening thoughts is that despite the narrative flaws of his films, Gareth Edwards is still a very good visual storyteller, which is why I would sometimes love to see him rely less on literally tying these threads together in a scripty way and just sort of let a vibe wash over us and create this emotional smothering, if you will. And I think he has the ingredients to do that here. And I get, if he were to do that, this makes it more of an artful piece. It is not going to sell at all, even probably worse than what it's doing now. But I think that kind of vibe would fit his skill set way better than what he keeps trying to do.
I agree. The script here, I'm convinced it was written by ChatGPT.
Oh,
And
that's so
would only
ironic.
make sense. It would only make sense to me.
That is so
Because
ironic.
it is the biggest issue of this film, aside from how it depicts Southeastern Asia, and we'll get to that. The biggest issue with the writing is that its entire emotional core hinges on a 60-second interaction at the beginning of the film between Joshua and Maya and their unborn child. We don't spend any significant time with them. We don't have any context as to what's happening. And after a brief exchange, the film injects a sense of urgency that crystallizes in grief for Joshua. And once again, I'm reminded of Joe Brody in Godzilla, or Jin and Galen Erso in Rogue One, where the artificial emotion that comes with these characters is wholly manufactured. And as a result, Joshua's motives feel distant. The manipulation of his character, where his grief is exploited by the Hal character, played by Allison Janney, it comes off as contrived. Now, to be fair, the film does offer more context to Joshua and Maya as it unfolds and as its mystery unravels, but it's still not enough to give credence to the pathos it's aiming for. Honestly, the whole "who is Maya really" subplot is confounding. Even if all the information is there, the way it's presented is murky. And this is where the performances are critical, because I do think John David Washington and Madeline Voiles, they are great. They help make up that gap a little bit.
Especially her. Madeline
she
is really good.
She's so really good. But
she also has the least dialogue of anyone in the movie. You notice that too, right?
I agree. But when it comes to their relationship, we do spend a lot of time with them together. Their relationship becomes sincere and poignant. And I think individually, both Washington and Voiles are able to render some sort of emotional credence, even if Maya feels like some sort of mythical figure that lingers distantly. One of the greatest moments in the film that is indicative of this is that moment near the end where they're in some sort of temple, I'll say vaguely, where we see Alfie embracing Joshua. And there's one little line from Alfie about her mother. And to your point, Brendan, it's that line and mostly this introspective emotion that she channels. And it is heartbreaking. It is really fantastic. Again, it has nothing to do with the film and how it conveys the emotion. It's wholly because of Alfie, how she delivers that line, the facial tics of the moment. I will give Edwards credit for how he frames it, but it's mostly on these performers. Where I think about Joshua and Alfie's final moment together, which I think is great because of the performances. Without them, the film would have been much more of a slog, but thankfully they do give some very engaging performances, hinging the film's emotional backbone on a very brief moment early in the film just isn't very effective. But that's what Edwards does. The emotion of his films all come down to brief interactions that just don't have much of a payoff. Godzilla did this, Rogue One does this, and the creator does this. It's just the Edwards DNA.
They feel like almost like mini short films or potential short films, all functioning within a giant, grander scale. And a lot of it is built on human or quote unquote human interaction, character interaction more than anything else. There is even a brief reunion of sorts toward the end between John David Washington and another character, I'll simply say without giving it away. And their embrace from a performance standpoint, it is surprisingly tender. And I thought to myself, that could be a full movie right there, or at least that could be a full act. And then it got me thinking, the other problem I have with the narrative here, it literally feels like a trilogy crammed into one movie. And I can't help if Gareth Edwards maybe just got a little ahead of himself in trying to craft the story he wanted to tell and really thought, if I don't get a chance to tell everything I want to tell, it's got to be in this one movie. And that is unfortunate if that is less so on Gareth Edwards and more so just on the lay of the Hollywood land and trying to get original content made like this nowadays. And maybe there is that realization and that inevitability in there. And that's an unfortunate reality, which we can honestly talk about that notion for hours here. But if there is any emotionality here, it is because of brief interactions with characters and these performances. Madeline, as we talked about, she is so good here. She's able to sell the film's very obvious religious subtext, not even just that temple you were talking about, but the fact that her powers are literally a form of prayer.
It's also the Force.
It's the Force.
I
mean, I've heard people say she's basically Baby Yoda in this movie. So yeah, so there is that obviousness there, and I would have been okay with that if the film then doesn't go out of its way to include a conversation literally about heaven. To just literalize that even further for us, which I personally didn't really need. But again, it's like this double-edged sword, because I do think the performances are still good.
Well, I was going to say, like, I don't mind that as much because the performances do evoke a pathos with that dialogue, given the grief that is driving them. I just wish the film would slow down to emphasize that or let it carry weight with these characters.
Yeah,
but sadly, that's not what it does. Most of what we see here is plot driven, or the exchange is brief because we have to get to the next set piece, whether it be the religious subtext of the film or what it might be doing in terms of deconstructing artificial intelligence tropes, or even the stereotypes that it's portraying in terms of Southeast Asia, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Whatever it may be, the film is treating most of that as some sort of background element.
Yeah.
And we never get to truly wrestle with the implications of what it is depicting, especially the artificial intelligence stuff. You know, because this is a movie where it has these sci-fi concepts such as, you know, you're able to take memories from a deceased human and implement them into a cyborg or an artificial intelligence robot and gather that data. That's an interesting idea, but what does the film do with that aside from use it as a plot element? That's all that it is.
It's a convenience. There are a lot of interesting ideas here that are more used as plot convenience, just to move the needle along, as opposed to really focusing on the intrigue of those ideas. And that's another example as to why I think the film's depiction of artificial intelligence is a bit myopic, while also simultaneously being kind of provocative. The provocative nature of it, I don't think, is a credit to the film, because given the landscape of Hollywood nowadays, there is a lot of negativity towards the power of AI and what it can do to really take Hollywood people out of a job, right? I mean, that has been the basis of the past 5 or 6 months with SAG and WGA. Like, that has been the conversation for a while. And here's a film that essentially is kind of pro AI, at least from a cultural standpoint. Now, that notion on its own terms is pretty provocative, but it's only provocative because the film came out today. If it came out in any other time, it's a one-sided movie. It has no nuance whatsoever. So if I say there's a provocative nature here, it's not a credit to the film. It's a credit to when it came out, which I don't think is necessarily a praise for the film. And I think it's a missed opportunity then.
Where I would somewhat push back on that, I do find some of that, at least in a vacuum, a little bit subversive, because the film wants us to believe that it was AI who became aware of itself, and therefore it started this war and wants to end humanity for its own power, yada, yada, yada. We've seen that 1,000 times before. However, it's interesting how AI is literally never a threat in this film, to your point.
Yeah.
Again, I wish the script did more to fully realize that idea.
Agreed.
Because their passivity is kind of fascinating when it's revealed what their weapon is to win the war, the innocence of it, and why it has so much power symbolically. There's some really great irony there that I do appreciate, even if the film
That's a good point.
even if the film fails to survey it fully, because most movies, it's the other way around.
Right.
So I think accidentally it becomes pro AI, and given our cultural status, yes, it becomes a little weird in the moment. However, I do appreciate what it's aiming for in terms of, subverting the conventional trope with artificial intelligence that we see in terms of how we view them as a threat.
Yeah, and if anything, maybe this is a nice moment to transition to the film's depiction of New Asia, because I think if anything, maybe AI is meant to represent more. It's meant to function more as a metaphor, I guess, for from a cultural and ethnic standpoint, and especially as we look at the Vietnam War, especially. And if that's how it's meant to function, I can at least appreciate the film for trying to have a bit of a timelessness to it in that way, despite the timing of when it came out, being now when AI is such a talking point. So I can at least appreciate that, but it does get lost in the maneuvering, the conveniences of it all, and especially the fact that Gareth Edwards has so much on his mind. He's trying to tell it all. He's trying to fit 10 pounds of AI crap into a 5-pound bag, and and what happens? The bag gets overweight. It breaks. It rips, and you could definitely see this stretching thin a lot of the time.
Yeah, the film's politics are dubious at best. Now, I will admit, Brendan and I aren't really the face to being in front in terms of this discourse, and I certainly understand that.
Yeah.
It's why we tried to get Winley here for this conversation. As we noted earlier, sadly, we just couldn't work out the timing.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk about it because it is such a crucial aspect to this film that I don't think the film gets right at all. And I do want to point to that thread from when, as Brennan alluded to earlier, that he said we could use as a reference. In this thread, Wynn says, and I quote, "It's certainly apparent the parallels to the Vietnam War." We noted that.
Yep.
No one who identifies as New Asian, humans or simulants, are safe from the horrors of war. I somewhat credit the film for not over dramatizing their distress and making sure that distress will always register on an emotional level more than a visual one.
Yeah.
But the one thing I can't overlook in the film is the blending of Southeast Asia and in turn Asian cultures that can't go beyond quote unquote cool to do so. It's supposed to be a unified front, but since the characters are so underdeveloped, it's Total Recall all over again. There needs to be more than just nice aesthetics so that the blending can be new and fresh, as opposed to being a playground that validates tropes the community has been trying to dismantle, end quote.
Yeah.
From there, he also notes that while some Asian characters do get to speak and have some key dialogue in the film, even getting to talk in their own dialect, it's not always authentic, and some characters are not speaking Vietnamese very well, despite having to convey some crucial information. He ends by saying, quote, "I'm honestly losing count on how many times the movies have made Vietnamese gibberish. That this is allowed shows how insignificant the Vietnamese culture is to productions," end quote. I do love Wynn's perspective, and
Agreed.
I think he makes a lot of great points. I may not have been cognizant to some of those details, but it's not hard to recognize how problematic it is to, one, depict all of Asia as its one unified country, especially in a vivid parallel to the Vietnam War, and secondly, infer that all of its occupants are subhuman by depicting them as artificial intelligence.
I it must be how we felt, JD, when we saw a movie like okay, this is going to be a random comparison to something like The Creator because they are not alike at all. But when you and I saw Kingsman: The Golden Circle, and we saw how Matthew Vaughn said that Kentucky and Texas are the same thing.
Yes.
Now, again,
I totally get where you're coming from.
Okay,
there, yes.
now that might not be the best comparison because clearly what Wynn is talking about has more dire ramifications, and I
For
understand
sure.
that,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to make light of that. And if anything, I'm just trying to find a different cultural relatability that maybe we can take with in a very high level way, if that makes any sense. But I do like the way that Wynn is articulating this so eloquently as well. If you're not following Wynn Lee on X or Twitter, you really need to change that.
Yeah.
You really do. He's a wonderful writer, wonderful critic, but I love the way that he articulates this, even going out of his way to at least acknowledge that the film doesn't over dramatize the elements of the Vietnam War, at least making those parallels. So there is at least some level of respect he's trying to give the film, but it becomes this myopic viewpoint once again, right? That it just seems to paint this culture as one thing. And if the attempt was to try and form some sense of unity, as that was like the thematic crux of the film, I do think it unfortunately fails because it just doesn't dive further enough into that to make that seem like it was the deliberate point, if it ultimately was.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the film's myopic viewpoint is, well, I think what's interesting is I don't think the film is aware of it. It avoids being a white savior narrative by casting John David Washington. It does get off on a technicality, I guess. But from a
well, that's the thing. Yeah, it's a
perspective-
technicality. The narrative isn't any different, though.
Well, and that's the thing, because at the end of it, from a broader perspective, it's still an American man who's the protagonist, wink, wink, once again, and liberating a part of the world that doesn't really define him. The film might think it's some sort of commentary on the Vietnam War or Asian sci-fi tropes. I think that's what it's trying to do. But in truth, I think it ends up playing more into those aspects than doing any sort of real interrogation. Because again, the script is mostly concerned with plot and spiraling from one set piece to another. It very rarely slows down to examine any sort of emotional truth with these characters, as we talked about, or investigate why it depicts Asia the way it does inside of its parallels. Taking some time to inspect those tropes would not only render some actual commentary on why they are vapid, but in doing so, it might give way for why Joshua is so deeply connected to New Asia outside of the superficial romance motivation, which in this context really isn't enough because it's so thin.
Well, and I do think those ideas are on Gareth Edwards' mind, at least as it relates to the Vietnam War as its most direct parallel. And the reason why I think that weirdly comes down to the film's soundtrack, not the score by Hans Zimmer. I think did the score for this movie. Which really good. I'll at least give him credit there. The score is really good. Does a lot of heavy lifting for sure. But the soundtrack here, there are two needle drops in particular that I thought were really quite compelling. And one of them, I think, does cue us in, or at least if you're familiar with the song and its meaning, it cues us in that there is meant to be a Vietnam War parallel here. And that was the song that plays when the truck bursts out of the barn. That song is called Child in Time by Deep Purple. It came out in 1970, and it is about the Vietnam War. So if that was the choice, then it is, I would assume, on Gareth Edwards' mind that he is perhaps going for those things, which ultimately makes the movie even more of a failure to me. That if that is on his mind, then he misses the boat in trying to understand that nuance even further.
I completely agree, especially because the lack of characterization, it's a big problem. Even if we remove the reductive unification of Asia and simply chalk that up to the film's perspective of Western imperialism, which we really can't do for all the reasons Wynn and other critics have pointed out. But if we do, where things are extremely foggy, it's the dehumanizing of its Asian characters.
Yeah.
Most of the Asian characters are merely a backdrop here.
Yeah.
And
so
the two
it kind of contradicts
characters,
itself then.
And of the two central characters, Maya is mostly a lingering ghost.
Yep.
We don't learn much about her aside from her sacrifice. And Alfie, as much as I love her, and some critics have already pointed this out, she has an American accent,
Yeah.
which might seem trivial, but it does remove pivotal context as she is from mainland Asia. It's one thing that the film's Asian characters are depicted as cyborgs or robots. And look, that could have worked if the film actually investigated its tropes, but it doesn't. There's no compelling cinematic argument for their humanity. And as a result, it's off-putting. At least it is for me. I can't imagine how others feel that are from Southeast Asia or any part of Asia for that matter.
Which is why the more we talk about this, JD, I know I jokingly said I don't think I can rank Gareth Edwards' films because there's just such consistency and quality for me. This conversation is making me tempted to say I do think this might be his worst movie. And it's primarily because of that squandered potential and because of that myopic viewpoint that just feels so incomplete. Because I do think he is going for something, and I do respect that on its face. But at least Rogue One had the benefit of being set in a universe I already really like. So that certainly helped. And there was a sense of scale with Godzilla that I think was able to at least overtake the film that I don't think this one, the creator, is necessarily doing. Like the scale is great, but I don't think it's as enveloping or as suffocating as those other films that I think almost weirdly work in their favors, right? And it allows us to focus on the problems at bay with regard to the film's narrative and its themes and how it's all depicting character.
Absolutely. And the thing with Godzilla is that it was essentially rebooting a franchise. So he's still working within the confines of something that already has mythology and lore behind it.
Yeah.
However, that was the first film of this new rebooted franchise. So there was a lot more restriction than the films we're getting now that have so much more expansion to it.
Yeah, this is
and
why
he still couldn't get the characters right.
This is why I really, really wanted to give Gareth Edwards the benefit of the doubt leading up to the creator, because you're right. Both Godzilla and Rogue One had overarching circumstances that could have potentially led to the messy narratives that both of those films had. One of them was setting up a universe, and it had so many characters to play with because of that. The other one, Rogue One, was notorious for its interference and the problems on set where Tony Gilroy had to come into play. So I kept thinking, if Gareth Edwards is just able to make a film on his own without any interference like that, could he succeed? And now I'm starting to think he can't.
It's interesting how it has the exact verbatim issues as those movies.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes down to immersing us into this world, as we talked about earlier. And as a result, the storytelling becomes lost. And there's a myopic viewpoint here that is so ill-conceived regarding the depiction of Asia and these Asian characters, the mishmash of cultures and ideas within, the cultural aesthetics that he wants to employ.
Yeah.
And even when it comes to AI, as we talked about earlier, all of it is treated as a passing background element.
Yeah.
There really isn't much here that invokes thought, emotion, or self-reflection. And that makes for an extremely frustrating experience. And it's one thing that, okay, we're going to myopically depict Asia as this one unified country, which we shouldn't, but that's what we're doing here. And we're going to convey all of its subjects as artificial intelligence. That's one problem. We're not going to really wrestle with artificial intelligence in any sort of meaningful way. It's mostly going to be a vapid experience because it's all in the background. Okay, we could have a conversation about all of that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the problems that that are rooted with both of those things come down to how we're just getting from A to B to C very quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that is the shell that we're working with here, that's the outline of the narrative, then how does he get the main characters wrong? Like, how is there still no emotion with Joshua? Like, why do I still feel so distant from him? And
Even when the performance is good.
Even with the performance as great as it is, and I love Joshua's relationship with Alfie, that's endearing on its own, and perhaps it's affecting because of the performances, but I don't think the script does much to earn that emotion, and especially Joshua's motives as it relates to Maya, that feels so contrived and manufactured. If all of this stuff is a problem because it's lingering in the background, how does that become an issue? That's the main thing here.
I don't have an answer.
I don't get it.
I don't get it.
But it's the same problem I had with Godzilla. Those characters are shells and nothing more. And I love those performers.
Yeah.
I don't have anything against the cast of Rogue One either. And yet the emotion is flat there.
Is Gareth Edwards going to be a director that's studied in film classes for this reason? That is,
I mean, to me is what is so confounding about the creator more than anything else. I could perhaps forgive, and I use that very loosely because I don't think its depiction of Asian culture here is appropriate at all. However, I will say this, I could at least understand that more, and especially I could forgive the fact that it completely fails to investigate its tropes on artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I could forgive that if Joshua was a well-rounded character that we're so vividly attached to emotionally. We understand his attachment to Maya and this redemption arc of wanting to be a father and how that comes through in Alfie. If that was so emotionally strong, like I had a first man like reaction to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. You had to focus on something and as a result, something gets lost. I get it.
Even
That's
so,
not what happens.
I know it's not what happens, but even so, it's this interesting after effect, right? You know, we talk about this all the time at a high level. Just make good movies. Just make good movies. But if you want to be more specific about that as it relates to the creator, just make good drama. You know, just make good drama when you need to, because in the case like this, I don't know about you, if the drama was there, at least for its main characters, I would retroactively start going back and trying to understand why some of those themes, some of those ideas on New Age or artificial intelligence seem as myopic as they are. Maybe there was a point to it. And the whole thing is like, if something really does work emotionally in a film, you start to try to understand maybe why a film is a certain way, as opposed to just accepting it as a flaw. Like you maybe think you kind of start to weirdly like fix the problem, right? Which in some ways is the sign of a good movie, maybe sometimes a smart movie. And sometimes that's why movies get better with age, because those things become more realized as time goes on.
Yeah.
But those pieces that need to work to even get us to that point, they're just not here. They're just not here.
Which circles back to something I said earlier in terms of acceptance. I have already accepted that this is a regurgitation of the Edwards formula.
Yeah.
So when I go back to rewatch this, I am simply going in, and I am actually somewhat eager to revisit this film because of its immersive experience. And I am eager to eat up those engrossing effects and just, you know, watch this from a visual perspective, because it is really fantastic in terms of its visuals, its set design, its score, as you noted earlier, which I'm also a fan of. And if you just look at it from a war perspective, I think there's some interesting things here in terms of how characters come and go. We don't really get to know them. And I think that is purposeful from Edwards's point of view in treating this like a war where soldiers die. Yeah. And that's how it is. In fact, one of my favorite elements of the film in that regard is this robot that I don't even know if it has a name, if we ever learn its name. It's a soldier. It's there. We see him in New Asia. He has a few lines of dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, he just gets blown up. Very anticlimactically. Just gets blown up. But he's in the film for like a good 25 minutes and is a solid supporting character during that 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Like that's how the film treats its character. It's like they just kind of, Ken Watanabe is probably the only one that has, I guess, some heft to him, but not like he's also one of those characters that just lingers in the background and stares into the camera. That's about it.
If anything, we get more from Joshua's one friend. I think his name is Drew, played by Sturgill Simpson, which was so distracting because this is country artist Sturgill Simpson, who I've seen live before. It's like, I've seen this guy at Forecastle in Kentucky. Well, he's from Kentucky. It's, but, talk about missed opportunities in the movie. You find out later that as a human person that is a bit indifferent to the idea of AI, he has a romantic relationship with an AI. And I thought, why isn't that the movie?
And again, the film fails to investigate that. It doesn't want to wrestle with any of these interesting concepts. It just shows it to us, and maybe I can appreciate that it doesn't. Like, I'm not asking the film to explain anything. I don't want it to explain it to us. But for it to just kind of linger in the background and carry no weight, that I do see as a problem. That's not the same thing as the film challenging the audience. It's not the same thing as the film wrestling with its artificial and tropes. That's an interesting irony, but that's all that it is, because the film doesn't take it any further.
Yeah. I feel like that's the perfect way to sum up this entire review. This movie it's all there is. It's all there is. It's a Gareth Edwards film. It's all there is.
Just a series of contradictions and a series of not exploring the things that it should, and
missed opportunities.
Wildly frustrated. Yeah, missed opportunities. Absolutely. That thing.
I wanted to love this one. I really did.
I did too.
Yeah. I'm bummed. Which is weird because, like I said in my opening, I kind of want people to go and see it because I want to see movies like this succeed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an IP film. I mean, again, it's not really an original story, but it's not based on an IP, so technically it qualifies as an original screenplay. So I want movies like that to succeed, especially if they are big blockbuster films of this caliber.
I agree.
And it's so well made too. Like you need to see it on a
extremely
big screen.
well made. The craft is fantastic. It's visually engrossing. I mean, there's so much to like here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just wildly immersive. That's the biggest thing that defines Edwards as a filmmaker, and the scale here is ridiculous once again.
It is.
I just wish that it wasn't so off-putting.
I know. Well, let's at least give credit where credit is due. It's a great-looking movie. We talked about how great it looks. Craig Fraser and Oren Soffer are the two cinematographers here. I don't really know much about Oren Soffer, but Greg Fraser we know very well, working on Dune, The Batman, just to name a few. This is an incredible cinematographer. So the film looks amazing. It looks absolutely amazing.
And the CGI is astounding for a film that cost $80 million. Like,
I agree.
You watch this, and what is Marvel's excuse? Or DC?
It's not you mentioned the editing being a bit of a problem, and I do agree, but that's really more how the editing works to serve the story. But I think the editing around the action sequences are pretty impressive because mostly things are at least still in camera and they're not choppy. They're not trying to mask certain imperfections that you sometimes get with many quick cut action films these days. So the camera does hold still for a while. So there is that tangibility there and that immersive quality you mentioned earlier. So I at least think that is really good.
Yeah. The cinematography is wonderful for sure. And when I mention the editing, it really is from a larger storytelling perspective. Yeah. Because
it's how scenes transition. It's how dialogue is like overdubbed over certain scenes that don't even need to be. It's like weird things like that.
The film just wants to get to the next set piece.
Yeah.
We're not slowing down to emphasize characterization or emotion.
Yeah.
Or investigate its tropes, whether it be Asian or artificial intelligence. We're not doing that.
Yeah.
We don't got time for that. We got to get to the next set, please, because there's a lot of plot here, guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of plot.
There's a lot of, like I said, it's a trilogy. It's a trilogy in one movie.
We got to get to the next thing. I don't got time. This is going to be a 6-hour movie.
I wonder if there is a 6-hour version of this movie. I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised.
Yeah. I mean, and to your point, maybe Gareth Edwards went into a meeting with the studio and he was afraid that he wouldn't get greenlit for a sequel, let alone 2 of them. And so he's like, I got to fit all this in case.
Yeah.
And maybe his fears were warranted because the marketing, I don't know if it was great. A lot of the feedback I received from people, especially those I would consider non-cinephiles, the regular audience, if you will, they didn't really respond to this trailer all that well. At least those that I know.
Yeah. I mean, as far as it functioning as a trailer and how it was edited to create excitement, I don't think that was there. Honestly, there was a weird passivity to even the trailer and the marketing for it. So maybe that had to do with that. I don't know. Or maybe people are just smart and they recognize the redundancy of this story.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's very apparent what the film is trying to do.
Yeah.
In just about every regard.
Yeah. And it has a weird title too. Of like you look at that title, and if you didn't see the robots or the sci-fi setting on the poster, you would think that with that font as well, that this were like some old epic Ridley Scott war film or something like that, which could have been confusing. I mean, I like that approach because I think that is meant to be purposeful for the film's themes that we talked about, but it might have led to some confusion as to what is this movie really. You know, for those who maybe only just saw the poster, it's like, I don't know what this is.
Well, and I think the fun irony of that too, and maybe this is meant to be intentional because of the subtext that you mentioned earlier, we never meet or see the creator.
No,
we see a character that is closely tied to the creator.
Yeah.
And by default becomes the creator, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying not to get into spoilers.
I think it's broadening what the term creator and creation ultimately is. I get that. Yeah.
So that could be part of the reservation. I don't really know. I don't think there was much excitement for the film, and maybe Gareth Edwards' fears were warranted if that theory you proposed is true.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I don't know
either way, there's just too much going on here and not enough time for emotion to be fully realized, and that's the biggest problem.
I agree.
Well,
I agree.
The second biggest problem, the biggest issue is the way it depicts Asia. Not good.
And I mentioned the soundtrack as well, which is my last thing I want to say about the film. There's another needle drop by using Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place, which was absolutely mesmerizing. It's that first raid on New Asia that basically closes the first act, essentially. And it's so well placed, so well timed, and so ironic because I just wish everything else from this movie was in its right place.
Fair enough.
It really did. Yeah. That song placement, perfect way to summarize the movie.
All right. Well, with that, let us know if you agree or disagree with anything that we had to say here. Hit us up on social media. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. We'd love to know where you stand. I know a lot of people did really like this film.
Yeah, I saw some great pieces on it from a few critics that we certainly love and respect. And, you know, from what I've seen, they actually had some pretty intriguing thoughts as to why it worked for them. I didn't quite agree, but I'm glad they're seeing something that we didn't, because like I said, I want to see a movie like this do well.
I agree.
Think it should.
Yeah, I definitely want to see movies like this succeed tremendously.
Yeah.
And generally that has been the narrative this year with films like Oppenheimer and Barbie.
Fair.
Outperforming movies like Mission Impossible even.
Yeah.
Let alone others like Fast X and Transformers and others that maybe we expected to not be super great.
Right.
I mean, Indiana Jones even underperformed.
Yeah. Oh, bomb. The Flash was even a bomb.
The Flash was obviously not great. It really has been the original properties that have done well. And maybe that's why the creator underperformed. It's original, but really?
I think that's the narrative. Is it though? Is it? Does this count? If Barbie is being like weighed on for being adapted versus original screenplay, that same conversation needs to happen here if it were up for awards.
I think the reaction to this film, I think, only feeds into that idea all the more that what we're really craving is original art.
Yeah.
Because this feels too familiar. It feels like Star Wars. It feels like Star Trek. It feels like Blade Runner. All these other movies that are so evident here.
Yeah.
We've seen it before.
And if anything, I feel like science fiction is kind of designed to be the most progressive genre. And I don't mean that in like a socio-political way. I mean that in a very literal way, that it's meant to be kind of forward thinking, right? That's kind of one of its best attributes. So when we go and see sci-fi, we kind of want to be surprised by something, right? And it's always unfortunate when we see a sci-fi film like this that is anything but that. In fact, it's more regressive than anything else. And that's what this is.
Absolutely. And, my last thought, and then we can get out of here. I do want to emphasize that its originality, though, isn't its biggest issue.
Right.
It's the execution. It's not what a film it's about. It's how it's about.
There it is again.
And, I don't care that this is a Star Wars regurgitation or a Blade Runner ripoff or whatever. The issue is the execution. And that's why we focused on that exclusively in our conversation.
Yep, absolutely.
That's the main issue. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. Let us know how you feel. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, man. I wish this could have been better. But Alfie was great. Oh,
Alfie,
I loved her.
can't wait to see her again.
Yeah, me too.